by the military-industrial complex.
And now, the Taliban will pay a price.
Do we have the confidence to do in the Middle East what our fathers and grandfathers accomplished in Europe and Asia?
The situation in Afghanistan is deteriorating.
What I do oppose is a dumb war.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Boardwalk podcast. Tonight, or today, depending on whenever you're listening to this, we're going to be continuing our conversation from last week where we're talking specifically the N2K area, which is Nuristan, Nangarhar, and Kunar. If you remember last week, we talked to Michael Dernick and Wesley Morgan regarding the Korengal and Pesh valleys. Tonight, we got Mitch Chahalis back with us, and we're going to be focusing on Nangarhar. It's a very, very interesting problem set throughout the war that I think very much like what we saw in Kunar and Nuristan was not very, wasn't out there as much as places like Kabul and Bagram and Kandahar, when you see the stories. So before we get into that, we'll provide a little bit of a backdrop about Nangarhar and why it's important. And it kind of ties into what Wesley was saying last week, right? Where you had at the beginning of the war in Afghanistan post 9/11, that's where Osama bin Laden was. That's where the closest we ever got to capturing him at Tora Bora was in Nangarhar, which is right on the Pakistani border. The way that bin Laden got to Nangarhar, granted he traveled throughout Afghanistan, was through the Soviet-Afghan War. You saw an influx of Arabs who wanted to join the Mujahideen. When they got to Afghanistan, a lot of them went up to that mountainous area. And granted, Nangarhar is not as mountainous as Kunar or Nuristan, but they all went up in that area. They linked up with the Mujahideen. They linked up with Pakistani ISI. They linked up with U.S. CIA operatives, and they really established their foothold there. So, Al-Qaeda was, it was born out of the Soviet-Afghan War, and it was born up in that N2K area. So naturally, post 9/11, that's where bin Laden felt the safest, and that's where he stayed up until he crossed over into Pakistan. I think that's a pretty decent introduction. I'm going to hand it over to Mitch, who's got stories for days about his fun times in Nangarhar. If you want to start us off with those, buddy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I haven't been on since last season, I think. So just a little context as to why I understand all these things I do about Nangarhar. So at a couple of my deployments, most of the ones in Ranger Regiment were focused on the ISIL-K presence in Nangarhar. So over those 4 deployments I had focused on ISIL-K. I was a task force targeting team J2. I was a task force targeting team senior analyst. Then I was a detailee to an interagency base in Jalalabad proper, which is the capital of Nangarhar Province, where there was a strike force based out of. And then I also focused on the province from Kabul when I was a liaison there. So to kind of frame up the area that we're talking about, as Zach led into, it's not nearly as mountainous as Kunar or Logman to its north. But it's very significant, and its geography is pretty drastic along the borderline, which makes it very strategic for anybody who can hold the ground. So Nangarhar is pretty much a big open farm field area, except for to the south, you have a mountain range, Tora Bora mountain range, that runs from Logar province all the way around to the Torkham Gate, where it eventually peters out to be foothills. Torkham Gate is also one of the largest, if not the largest, licit and illicit border crossing between Afghanistan and Pakistan, making Nangarhar a gateway into the country from Pakistan for people who are trying to trade illicit materials or to smuggle people, personalities in. And then the mountains continue further north up into Kunar province, where you get provided, no short of dozens of mountains of passes that you can pass through from FATA, the federally administered tribal areas in Pakistan. The most drastic terrain is those mountains to the south, Tora Bora. Some of those scale as much as 14,000 to 18,000 feet. And that is where the largest U.S. operation after the invasion occurred, which was the attempt to finally stop bin Laden from crossing over into Pakistan. Unfortunately, it was unsuccessful. The majority of the fighting was based in a district called Peshawar Gam, and it had a couple of passes that allowed bin Laden and his key circle of confidants to cross into Pakistan without the U.S. being able to even intercept them. And that kind of sets the stage for why the Nangarhar province was so important. Excuse me, a little bit of alcohol today on the flight. Watch out, I might have to edit that one out. that sets the stage for why Nangarhar became so important during the GWAT. So it was the place where Al Qaeda left their last trace before leaving the country. So U.S. agencies, U.S. Special Operations Forces immediately focused in on Nangarhar because of its access or for the Taliban and Al Qaeda to go and come and forth across the border as they please. And then also due to the hand in glove relationship that Al Qaeda and the Taliban have, once Al Qaeda left Afghanistan proper and started establishing most of its operations inside of Pakistan for its senior leadership, the Taliban prioritized this area for its own military efforts, and including the areas from Hisaraq, which goes from Kabul province all the way out to the east of Momandara, which is the essential southern swath of Nangarhar province where the terrain's pretty drastic and it was going to be hard to remove them. And the other thing that makes this extremely critical and a strategic piece of terrain to own is it is your gateway into Kabul from Pakistan. I can't tell you how many times, even before my counterterrorism days, that we had to deal with HPAs or VBIDs coming in from Pakistan that were going to transit through Jalalabad and then onto Kabul to take out a ANA target or a Gyroa Capitol building or something along those lines.
Like, so with that, especially regarding HPA, which for the non-military folks, that's high profile attack, and the VBIDs, vehicle borne IEDs. We've talked a lot about the Haqqani network, and Mitch is like an honorary member of the Haqqani network, given his knowledge of the network. They really focused their operations in that N2K P2K area. It's pretty well known that the VBID training and facilitation was coming through the northern part, or through the north, through the Torkham, or not necessarily Torkham, but through Jalalabad into Afghanistan. There was very little reporting I ever saw of VBIDs that could be verified being transported through southern Afghanistan. So that when Mitch talks about that part of the country being a facilitation hub, that is, I mean, there are technically two ways in, right? There's the Torkham Gate in the north, and there's the Chaman Crossing in the south, which goes into Spin Boldak. And I think the Torkham Gate had like double the economic activity of the Chaman Gate. Like, it is crazy how big and how important that gate is in that whole area. So when you have that kind of congestion, you're going to have a lot of shit that gets through.
Yeah, it's definitely like it has to be the biggest border crossing in Afghanistan, and this is a country that has a huge border crossing with Iran in the west, so that kind of gives you an idea of how major the Torkham Gate was. I mean, we'd often have guys that we had solid intel on that were trying to get out of the country, and would try to make their way just straight through the Torkham Gate, which there's an element of corruption there, because if you could pay off the guards, you'd be able to just slip right through. And there's the issue with U.S. forces not really having huge oversight over that area, so you'd have to try to get them before they make it over there. And yeah, like you were saying, usually like the areas in P2K, like Coast and Paktika and Paktia to an extent, are difficult to get vehicles through just because they're so mountainous, and there's only a few ways you can go. But if you can get your vehicles into Nangarhar, it's in like the central area, not necessarily the south. It's a lot flatter. There's a lot more options you have for roads. And I think a lot of times we'd see like a VBID making its way through Nangarhar, and then like the guy that was going to conduct the suicide attack making his way through like P2K sort of. So yeah, the Haqqani network had their claws in that pretty heavily.
If you scale out even further outside of Nangarhar and you look at the border towns that are across, or the towns that are across the border from the province, one of the most critical ones is Peshawar, which if you are a bad entity in Afghanistan or Pakistan, Al Qaeda, Taliban, TTP, ISIS, you have an office based in Peshawar. You probably get a little ISI help, and it is your direct line to send your fighters and or your attack, HPA attacks, high profile attacks, and VBIDs across the border through there as well, just to further add to the importance of it due to that proximity.
I'd love to go gun shopping in Peshawar. I've seen like several like videos of people buying guns at like these bazaars in Peshawar, and they're just like fully automatic, whatever. You want a PKM, we got RPGs. It's all for sale right out here in the open. So it's like, yeah. I mean, gun prices in America are ridiculous. And so I'm sure you could go get one for about $15.
$30 PKM.
Yeah.
If you want the good stuff, you don't even have to cross into Pakistan anymore, man. They're selling U.S. guns over in Kabul now. So
you probably
go to
the
Garesh,
J-Bad Bazaar.
Yeah, a bazaar like in Garesk or Jalalabad get you a nice M4 for $100 and a bag of rice.
Yeah, there was a shop right outside the main gate to Bagram that, like you could see it right from the edge of the gate if you were bringing someone on or whatever. And there's like just U.S. military uniform stuff. It was kind of like a U.S. surplus shop in the U.S. So I'm assuming they're now also selling all the swag guns and shit that we had. I'm sure you can get some Tech 2s or something over there.
You go to laundry there at Bagram, you got to make that payment on that charger, so you can just pawn off a couple of your uniforms they ordered for you, and then take them out there and sell them. Tell them
my dream. Do you guys remember the big ass bazaar area at Bagram?
Like with the PX and shit, where you get your haircut?
No, beyond that.
It was the one that was like you had to drive to get there. You couldn't walk.
Yeah. The big open bazaar. My dream is that like 5 years from now, the way that we would go there, and it was just like a bunch of Afghan shops. If some people go there, it'll be like a bunch of Western shops.
Yeah.
Just like a full 180. I mean, probably not going to happen. But
I wonder what that Burger King is used for now, because
halal meals.
Exactly. It's Lamb King now.
There was a King in Bagram.
So speaking of Jalalabad, out of curiosity, because I know that Jalalabad and like Peshawar and Kabul are all pretty close. So Peshawar is 81 miles away from Jalalabad. Like that
sounds about right.
It is.
Yeah.
It's like a 3-hour drive because the roads suck, but it's like 80 miles away. That's how close these entities are. That's how close, because J-Bad was what, like the 4th largest base, 5th largest base?
Something like that.
It was up there. It was one of the larger ones.
Yeah.
It was one of the hubs.
I think it's the 3rd largest city, or maybe it's the 4th largest city, because it's like Kabul, Kandahar, and then I think it's either J-Bad or
Kabul,
Herat.
Kandahar, Herat, then like
J-Bad.
Either way, big city, big base.
One of the RCs was based out of there, I think.
It was.
At least for a time.
Originally RC East was out of Nangarhar. Yeah.
So like we were 80 miles away is the Peshawar Shura, which is the Taliban's military
commission. Yeah. It's also where all the Haqqani brothers lived until they got their land back.
That, like, to put it in perspective, that's how close this shit is. It's crazy. I think the comparison like is DC to Philadelphia. Yeah. That's how close they are.
Uncle Rico could throw a football from J-Bad and hit Peshawar.
He could. And then the other way, J-Bad to Kabul is like 90 miles, right? So that's all pretty close together. And I think that led to, or that aided the importance and the strategic relevance for like the Haqqanis who were, conducting these V-bit attacks. Because for the most part, the big spectacular ones were up in Kabul.
Absolutely.
Right? Because you think once you get past the gates and you're in Afghanistan, so long as you've got decent OPSEC and COMSEC, you can get to Kabul and you can make it happen. Right. I think it was a little more difficult in the South because, the way Razik ran Kandahar.
Yeah. And Spin Boldak.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But once you got into the country and if your target was Kabul, there was a decent chance. Like we've seen it now in the last 6-7 months with the fall of Jaroa and the establishment of the Islamic Emirate, where like ISIL-K at the beginning of it, they had a V-bit attack in Kabul. They had a fucking attack down in at a mosque in Kandahar, which I think was the first time they'd ever conducted any sort of operation south of like P2K.
Yeah.
Like that was huge. So once you get in there, it's like a no man's land, and
right.
You pretty much got free reign as long as you can keep your mouth shut.
And the other thing that's important too about Jalalabad and Nangarhar as a whole, kind of, is if you think about it, if you look at it, the Kunar River comes down from Kunar Province. It splits the province right down the middle, big river valley, and it comes through and joins in northern Nangarhar. Then you have Highway 7 running east to west to Pakistan. And then you also have, I can't remember the name of the highway, but there's one that takes you into Logman as well. So if you are an Al-Qaeda operative or a TTP operative and you're coming in from Pakistan, you're probably going to go in through Nangarhar and you're going to cut north and you're going to go to Kunar that way because it's a natural line of drift. It's a pretty open MSR and it's not well guarded. And the same stands for if you're just, a regular Taliban guy coming across to go, conduct jihad in Logar province, for the fighting season. You're going to come in along Highway 7 and you're going to hook south before Kabul. And then you're going to, conduct your jihad and use the same way to go out in the wintertime. So anybody who's anyone that was fighting as a network in northeastern Afghanistan used Nangarhar all the time. And it was one of the most important transitory places for people to go and move through. And after they had settled those places where they were just pivoting out of Nangarhar, they decided to start spreading out and owning land in Nangarhar itself. And the way that I kind of view the province is there is the Al Qaeda and Taliban primacy time that existed in around 2009 to 2014. Then there is the ISIS-K primacy time that existed from end of 2014 up until about 2019. And then now, obviously, we've gone back to the Taliban's primacy in the area after they were able to remove the ISIS guys from the area, which likely also probably brought back some AQ stuff, but it's not as confirmatory as it was in 2013 when Al Qaeda facilitators from the TTP were operating out of Nangarhar specifically because of its safety.
I was just going to say, we talk I was there in 2015 doing the aviation stuff, and what blows my mind to this day, and sometimes when I think about it, I'm like, okay, well, all of our discussions here, the Taliban, the red, they're Taliban or whatever, but most of our targets, the high value targets we were after, were Islamic movement of Uzbekistan people. They were people associated with ISIS. There weren't very many Taliban high value targets on the old list, and I think that was maybe that was the Nangarhar deal. I don't know.
So there was an interesting rotation of very important personalities that existed in this sphere. I can only remember objective names suddenly, but one of them I don't remember. I remember his actual name. So Pir Gah is a name that came up a lot after he was removed from his position in Paktika, because he was one of the few people that was effective against the ISIS force. And so I also didn't really think that there was too much going on the Taliban side until I spent a trip as a detailee at the base in Jabad. And what I started to realize is the Taliban would rotate the equivalent of a brigade commander type of personality there on a seasonal basis to lead the fight against ISIS-K. People like Pir Gah, people like, all of a sudden all these objective names are coming to my mind. But anyway, Taliban military commander. Yeah, QZR was one of them as well. So they would rotate, the Taliban Shower Shura would rotate senior commanders through that area to lead the ISIS charge. And from 2015 to 2017, they obviously weren't very successful. And most of that was due to the fact that we were striking both sides of the FLOT, so the forward line of troops. So we were striking Taliban just as mercilessly as we were striking ISIS positions. And then you realize that the Taliban is the only ground force who cares enough about the area to root out ISIS. So we kind of pulled back on that as a strategy. And then when that started happening, they started putting more effective people like QZR and Pir Gah in charge. And suddenly you'd see, specifically in Khoigani and Shirzad, relatively mid to high level commanders, even sometimes a name that would pop that you didn't expect to be in Afghanistan. Now, was that Humid sometimes? Was it Sigurd sometimes? He was a little mix of both. So, if it's Humid, you got to take it at face value. But when the tide started to change in the ground war for the Taliban, they started to emphasize putting more important and effective personalities in charge because they wanted to get rid of ISIS, obviously.
Yeah, and I think they were pretty effective at it. Although, there's some pretty nasty videos from airplanes and some of that stuff.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. So I think up until the ISIS time frame, the two most important aspects that Nangarhar was able to give to the Taliban insurgency was Al Qaeda facilitation through TTP, because those were the guys that were primarily coming across the border and using the passes to get leadership in for council and stuff. And then facilitation of personnel and then money making things. This includes opium and drugs, weapons, training camps, because the terrain in southern Nangarhar afforded Haqqani personnel, Taliban personnel, TTP personnel the ability to set up training camps for complex attack operations, for general one-on-one training camps, and also the refraction from our ability to detect their signals was insane in this area, so they use it as a safe haven for their senior leadership as well.
So when you're talking about Piraga. My first thought is the Piraga from Zabul. Is it that same one?
You from
That had like
Paktika?
was he from Paktika? I remember at one point we had a Piraga in Zabul who actually
I
had like
think
a Daily Beast article written about him, about how cruel and effective he
Yeah,
was.
I think it is the same guy because if I remember his path correctly, he might have started off in Zabul or maybe even Kandahar and then Zabul and then
I
Paktika and
I
then
think yeah
everybody thought they killed him and then he popped up in Nangarhar.
I think he started in Kandahar as like a regional guy, and then he became like the Zabul shadow governor, and
Yep.
then moved forward from there.
Yeah,
Which
yeah,
funny.
just the
So with
Taliban like location efforts that they always did
The seasonal
yearly.
shuffle.
Yeah,
I will say though, so when I was there for two shuffles, and I can't speak much on the first one just because I was a new analyst at Kandahar. But on the second, when year two came around, they had the second shuffle. I remember looking at, and can't get into names. I remember looking at the shuffling. I was like, holy fuck, I would have made all these same decisions if I were the Taliban. Right? Like if I'm trying to just like cement my control, I would have moved that person X to this area and person Y to that area, and they did all of that stuff, right? And I think that's around the time that Piragal was starting to. That was 2017, so he was already moved up to where you were at. I think the Taliban, with Habatullah Akhundzada coming in as the emir, they got a lot better at where they position people, identifying strengths and capitalizing on that. And I think that was pretty obvious, especially in the South. And then sounding like, with the introduction of the ISIS-K problem, they had to kind of figure it out, and they got really good at it to the point that by 2019 they rooted out an insurgency within their own insurgency.
Absolutely. I mean, granted, they did have a pretty sick Air Force over top of them in the form of the U.S. drones, but they did actually do the ground fighting, which was pretty important because the only people who were willing to do that was some of the interagency units. Um, so to further speak on the, like I would say, I guess the progressing timeline post Taliban and Al Qaeda, primacy here in Nangarhar. To as we keep leaning into the ISIS-K problem set, and I think the reason why we're really apt to say that is for the majority of the time we're putting in the lion's shares of our work in Afghanistan, a lot of us had made Nangarhar synonymous with ISIS-K, and I think I spoke on this a little bit when I was talking about the counterterrorism mission in Afghanistan. But just to circle back and drive it home for everybody, around the end of 2014, some of these TTP folks who had ties to Al Qaeda were very familiar with the area and specifically the Pakistan regions across the border, and Moman Karam Agency and Khyber as a whole. They pledged allegiance to ISIS in Syria, and they formed the first branch of ISIS in the AFPAC region. And after they did that in Pakistan, their very first move, which was extremely tactical and strategic at the same time, was to go over the border from Pakistan and seize some of the critical districts that exist in southern Nangarhar because the geography afforded them a very defensible position from both the Taliban and any U.S. airstrikes. So that's when Nangarhar kind of became a reemergent focus for U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Because I would say probably up until 2015, we would go there when we had to for the people that mattered. But just as Kyle mentioned, there wasn't a lot of big name Taliban guys up in there until the ISIS fight. So we never really prioritized it beyond general district stability operations.
I always thought it was so funny too, and not funny, but like in a strange way. Like we'd be flying these missions, hunting high value targets, and no one ever asked questions about the names on the list. You know what I mean? It was like I'd wake up that day, somebody would come up to me and they would say, "Here's your list." And I'm like, "All right." Like just, I mean, in a true kind of catch-22 kind of scenario, it's like I've got a list of people that somebody's declared bad that we're going to try to kill, and it's like I have no idea what any of them have done. I mean, they could have stolen like a lollipop from someplace. I'm like, all right,
I was talking
you're
about
on the
that
list.
targeting dynamic with one of my buddies this weekend. He lives in Denver now, and I was there for work last week and stayed the weekend to kick it. And we were talking about like how the task force used to churn and the rate it would do it, and how obviously we had thresholds for like credibility in order to make sure we could get after certain things, and that always seemed to really apply more to the high value things. But then there was also a way to embrace making sure there were numbers that mattered. These are podcast air quotes. Because you could always objectify a target if they had the right communication network.
Yeah, I was always so jealous of the Rangers, like not just like the amount of assets that you guys had, but also the targeting requirements because I think they were probably they were good, but they were probably the lowest in country. I know for a while targets were getting listed as like ISIS. There were suddenly a lot of ISIS affiliated targets that
Yeah,
that were named in order for us to go after guys, and I'm sure all of it was completely legitimate. But
that is a
ISIS definitely helped our targeting efforts.
that is a good segue point, Stu. I appreciate that. So what I will say is, as I mentioned, ISIS took over a bunch of territory in southern Afghanistan. And as Stu mentioned, the Rangers, or the unit I was with when I was in the military, had very favorable ROE, or rules of engagement, in order to target the enemy, because that's kind of what they were just there to do, is to win the war of attrition while taking out select HVTs in the right network. What we did is to backpedal, when ISIS stood up, we didn't have authorities to target them. We had very specific authorities against AQ and against the Taliban, only if they were involved in HPAs. Then suddenly, in the early winter of 2015, so about January or February, we get permissions to target them as we see fit. That was early winter 2016. To see them as we see fit. And so what happened was we essentially created this line of demarcation, or the forward line of troops, the FLOT, and we used to update it with NGA data all the time. And basically, if you were an adult male that lived below this line of demarcation that we created in Nangarhar, you were completely fair game, because all of the intelligence that we had indicated that everyone below that line was affiliated with ISIS, pledged bayat or loyalty to ISIS, and was a functioning member of ISIS's cells. And so while they first showed up in country, didn't have authorities, they were really stoked. They were walking around in 25-man files with rifles and kind of untouched, and were able to do whatever they want. After we got authorities and started doing our things, they didn't do that so much anymore, but we still had the ability to prove from the intel we were getting off the ground how far they had moved, either east or north, and then started doing what you had mentioned, Stu, where it was a lot of ISIS affiliates just because they were in ISIS territory.
Remember Stu and Zach, that video of watching that ISIL training school just get blown to pieces, and all those guys out there doing like
they were like ninja kicking the plates and stuff.
The prone row. They're out there doing cadence PT, and then they're just all smoked, and then there's nothing left. Like, oh wow, that was nuts, man.
Did you guys ever see the prisoner video of like the ISIS guys in Momun Valley? Yeah. It was ISIS in Momun Valley. And like 7 people? Yeah.
I watched that.
Let us get authorities. Was that video right there?
I was sitting on Bagram with the rest of the guys. We were tracking it, and we watched that happen live. And that
I was SIA for the team at the time. Right. We were like doing our first deep dive. It was me and my J2, and we're doing our very first team deep dive, which the team is like us two and like 2 SIGINT analysts. And they're like, "Hey, you guys got to come out into the JOC and look at the feeds." And we come out there, and it was like, "Oh shit," you know what I'm saying? And then after that, a week later, literally, they were like, "You guys could do whatever you want."
Yeah, like they were doing that. They were like executing those, I guess, Taliban members or whatever, and they chopped all their heads off. And then
full on propaganda. They had horses
making
run
video.
by
they had a horse.
Yeah, the guy did like the round robin on the horse and stuff.
Yeah,
and then they got shot with a missile. I guess somebody finally talked somebody into shooting it, and then
we were so depressed watching.
Was it?
They were chopping dudes' heads off, and he was like, "You need to let me do something about this." And by the time we got authorities, the 7th dude got dropped, and then we were like, "All right, well, we're still going to do this anyway."
So they shot the guy. The guy's horse like bucked him. I remember.
I remember
for whatever
that.
reason, like this thing is like completely ingrained in my memory. Like, I mean, it's just one of those things I can.
It's one of those vivid things that There's a lot of times you've seen the same ISR feed 1,000 times, and I've only seen that one time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. There had to be like 200 villagers around, so we're like, well, there's no way we're gonna get permission to do this, but.
And whoever shot it was accurate as hell too, because
it was so accurate.
executioner.
All of the leadership and the guy. all the leadership and the guys that were recording it came together to have like a post
Uh-huh.
beheading
Like
briefing, and then the missile
congratulatory
just
high five and shit. Yeah, it was
yeah.
good. That
Yeah.
was a good one. That was one of the better ones. And then we
That
actually
was
ended up getting a few detainees a few years later who told us the story about what was going on in that whole thing. And apparently, what happened is they were going to execute these prisoners. It was like half Pakistani mil, half Taliban dudes. And like a bunch of the guys we ended up striking was like the people that stood up their media cell, as you could imagine. So that was a retroactive W, big time.
yeah.
I guess that
It's just
explains
wild.
why that video never
Yeah,
never made
never
it
made
onto
it. Yeah, I
their
don't think that
website.
camcorder
Hey.
saw the other side of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think that's going to be viewable on YouTube to anybody. So you guys have to rely on
Yeah.
our description of it.
Yeah. I don't think they were streaming to the cloud while they were
No,
videotaping.
I don't
No,
think
no.
anybody will ever see that except us. But that's nuts. It's like watching, it's like we all saw the same movie and we're all talking
Yeah.
about it.
Like,
Yep.
Nobody
one of
else
the
has seen
one of the things the Islamic State always did pretty well was propaganda, right? I remember being an analyst when I was still in at JBLM, and I kind of got free reign to just like track ISIS, even though we were focused on the PACOM Pacific area,
Yeah.
and they certainly paid attention to all the Al Qaeda media classes, right? Because their print propaganda was very well done.
Yeah.
Uh, so
Topic.
to see
Super
that, yeah,
professional,
the bleak. I remember I would read it every month, and I'm like, it's a good thing I'm doing this within a like secure facility, because if I was
Oh,
like
yeah.
reading this on an airplane, like, no, it's just for work. Okay, I'm just it really
Yeah, at
piss
275,
people off.
we would put the newest issue in the bathroom, and like dudes from the S3 shop would go in there and be like, "What the hell?" They're like, "Hey, we got a subscription."
Yeah. I have an anecdote about that. Like before my my third trip in 2015, our S2 came over to us and he's like, "Guys, why don't our products look better?" We're like, what do you mean, sir? It's like, it's PowerPoints. Like, well, look at what ISIS is putting out. Like, why why is ISIS putting out a better product than us? Like,
Somebody paid for their Adobe license.
because
Yeah.
they have something better than PowerPoint to make it on. Like, Jesus, come on.
And
I
that's
can only
what
do
they,
so much with word art.
Yeah.
They also
Yeah.
have to reach a wide audience. I just have to put it in front of a general who's not going to read it anyway. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't
Right.
matter what it looks like.
It's all about the picture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like when you're talking about the ROE, and I wouldn't say relaxing it, but streamlining it.
Right.
We had Matt Jarvis on in season 1, where we were talking about like 3 times a week we would go and we meet up with the guys over at Camp Brown, which is the SF compound. I
Yep.
had one
That was me
meeting.
for one deployment.
I had one intel share with the Rangers, and holy fuck, man, it was annoying to say the least. So the Rangers had a little office in the Kandahar, or the Kandahar Intelligence Fusion Cell.
Yeah.
And one day they're like, "Hey, you want to come in?" And we're discussing a couple targets in the area. I'm like, "Yeah, sure." Right. So I go in there, and they bring up a guy who I've been tracking, and they're giving me all the information on him. And like, okay, so are we good on this? I'm like, wait, the pattern of life doesn't match up with what we have on file, right? Like it's not even close. And like, no, this is him. I'm like, no, that's not him. That's not like we don't have that phone associated with him. We don't have his those movements associated with him. I'm not sure that's him. I pulled in one of our SIGINT analysts, who before he became a SIGINT analyst was an 18 Bravo, which for those at home is a Special Forces member.
That's
he
a
comes
leap
in.
you don't usually make either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He went from 18 Bravo to SIGINT.
Yes.
Right. So we pulled him in. He's a pretty cool guy. We pulled him in, and he's like, yeah, this isn't adding up. And, he's providing his expertise, and he's a lot more credible than I am. Right. And the Rangers go, fuck it. We're going with this anyways. All right, fine. Cool. Whatever. Good intel show with the Rangers that one day.
Yeah. Well, what I will say to defend my prior organization, because I came from the other organizations, is I remember multiple times being like, oh man, here's what I got. I know this shit. And then I got to the other side of the curtain where you had like way more access. Like I was like, I used to joke with people, I was 75% SIGINTer because like the system we used was such a blend of NSA Net and classic TS, that, there was some stuff that would change people's mind that you couldn't share. I'm not saying that what they did necessarily was the move, wasn't my shop that was there when that happened, but to put up a plausible excuse is probably just because of like some of the different accesses that we had.
Maybe they could have
Sometimes
said
it
that
was
though.
sometimes it was faster.
I wouldn't have poked the bear.
Oh
You know?
man, but right? So like me, like I obviously had to deal with the regular army stuff. Even when I was on the other side, I used to hate to like try to rub it in on people's faces. You know what I'm saying? Because like I always knew better. I was like, man, I remember the other side. Like, don't be that guy. You know what I mean? You never wanted to be like, oh, I can't tell you, and here's why. And be like, oh man, yeah, crazy.
Yeah, it's especially when I had never met the guy and he never met me. Yeah, I could see not wanting to take that step, but yeah, it wouldn't have bothered me. You know, as far as I know, the guy is still alive, so it doesn't matter anyways.
Exactly.
I did want to bring up a fun anecdote, since Stu brought up a fun anecdote regarding the Torkham Gate and the Great Tobacco Shortage of 2017.
Oh
God! Oh, yeah, people
those
remember
motherfuckers.
This.
Were you there for that, Mitch?
Oh yeah, that's one of the few. That's one of the 2 times in my life I smoked Marlboro Reds.
So, for the people listening, apparently every piece of tobacco went through Torkham. Nothing came through the Shaman crossing into Spinball Deck. And on one fateful day in 2017, a truck carrying all the cigarettes and all the dip for the country got blown the fuck up. And that made a 2-week delay in anybody getting any sort of nicotine. And if you're not aware, wars are fought on coffee and nicotine. And it has to be a combination of the two.
And pre-workout.
And pre-workout, the old Jack 3D original formula. You lift the house.
Amphetamine approved.
Yeah. And so I think that was like in the early spring, right? Like April timeframe. They I think it was. I'm not sure who it was.
If I remember correctly, I think it was TTP, and I think they crushed like half of a Pakistani convoy that was taking our stuff across the border and some mountain pass right before it got to Torkham.
Yeah. So long story short, we didn't have any tobacco, and this is back when Stu and I smoked and dipped. Correction, we chain smoked and chain dipped, sometimes at the same time. And so for the next 2 weeks, man, it was rough. We had a warrant officer who, like, when he was done with the dip, he'd throw it in like a Ziploc bag and put it in his freezer, like trying to just salvage it for as long as possible. That was the worst 2 weeks in Afghanistan, was when Zach and Stu and Mitch didn't have their tobacco. And I remember once the stuff finally came in, there's like a 2-pack limit. So I'd go over there and I'd buy my 2 packs, and then I'd find somebody that didn't smoke, and I'd give them my debit card. I don't give a fuck. Go buy 2 more packs of Camel Crushers or whatever it was that I was smoking, because I know this shit's going to run out, because there's pretty much a half supply. So I would like to thank the TTP for stressing us out for a week back in 2017, because I was trying to do my job without nicotine. Not very cash money of you guys.
No,
not very cash money at all. Yeah, definitely. They had no idea how effective that attack was.
Wow, we stopped all intelligence from working for like.
Yeah, if ever there was a time to send some bombs into Pakistan, it was then.
Yeah, definitely.
You think like some old general that just like chews beech nut or something was like pissed that day, and, like,
oh, definitely
got like a predator to fly across the border and just blow something up in
they hit
generals have their own hookups.
That's true.
Their shit gets flown in direct.
Yeah. With
maybe we should have
cognac and everything.
Maybe we should have petitioned to Nicholson to have his wife, upon her next round trip back to Afghanistan, bring like a couple cartons of smoke, since she always came into Kandahar, right? Like, why not do that? Oh, we're not supposed to talk about the fact that his wife was like on the take and shit. I'm sorry.
What I did is I had my Terps go down to the bazaar and buy cigarettes for me, and they came back with Marlboro Reds, and they were the ones that are from like the Philippines that you get in Afghanistan, and it's like taking a rip out of like a car exhaust. It's like the worst thing in the world. But if that's all you got, that's all you got.
That's how the cigarettes in Iraq were, man. They were bad.
Yeah, they were probably from the Philippines too.
They were from, as far as I know, they were from Turkey. And it was $1 per pack or a carton for $7. Lowry Lowry haggled some dude down to $4 for a carton once.
I believe it.
They were so bad.
Yep.
You probably
I
shouldn't
believe
smoke
it.
cigarettes. It's certainly not $4 a carton cigarettes.
Oh yeah.
Don't tell me how to live my life, Kyle.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were these. I don't think they were Camel Crushes, but there were these like dual crush cigarettes that I got when I went to Lightning. You'd crush. There were these little like
The little snack
menthol
balls that were
balls,
inside
yeah.
the filter. Yeah, I remember that.
And I'd never seen this, but they had two balls in the in the filter, and one was like mint, and the other one was menthol, and you'd like pop both of them and then smoke it, and it was like breathing in a cool winter day. Just I don't know. Those are some of the best cigarettes I ever had.
Anybody
I got 'em from
craving
the
a
Haji
cigarette
shop
right
in
now?
Texas.
Oh man, I was already thinking about when we get off of this. I'm gonna go burn down an American spirit.
Yeah, I switched over.
Come on, yeah.
I had quit smoking, and as I've told my wife, I haven't smoked now in a couple of years, and my wife asked me why I still smoked as long as I did, and I was like, you don't understand the feeling of the first cigarette of the day. That is the best feeling in the world.
Oh, dude, for me, it's that cigarette you had after 3 drinks. You know what I'm saying? Because you're just starting to feel the buzz, and you go out there and you rip it down. Like, that's a good cigarette.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
So yeah, I haven't even thought about smoking in a while, but this conversation is tempting me. But I won't smoke. My mom's listening. Mom, I'm not smoking, so don't worry.
Good for you. My mom's not listening, and I'm gonna go smoke a cigarette after this one.
Boardwalk podcast sponsored by Philip Morris.
Thank you for smoking.
For all your whatever Ferrari and F1, they can't put it like Philip Morris on there, so they can't put Marlboro on their car, so it's like Mission Winnow or something.
Yeah.
But if you like go to Mission Winnow's page, it's like some
A subsidiary
BS marketing
for
term. It's like, what is this? It's like, oh, it's just Philip Morris.
That's how they get you.
It's a loophole.
Yeah, it's a huge loophole.
Speaking
So back to sorry.
Back to Nangarhar.
Go ahead.
Back to Nangarhar. So with ISIS making their way in, did you guys ever? I think it was a Vice documentary, as all of the documentaries are in Afghanistan. But there was an ISIL-K documentary where some journalists like embedded with ISIS and Nangarhar, and they were just talking about like their way of
Nangarhar,
life.
or was that in Kunar? Because I remember like
It might have been.
Right after they came over and they took over, they got a bunch of dudes from TTP Bajir to switch over who were up in Chaugam and Dangam district in Kunar. And I remember like seeing, I think it was Vice, so that's why I'm thinking this might be the one, where they like walked around Chaugam and they were talking to these ISIS commanders, and they were like,
did they go to
down
the
with the
school on that one?
Taliban. Yeah, exactly.
Dude, it was some Hitler Youth shit, man. It was
Absolutely.
fucking creepy. They get these little kids together and they show them like how to practice shooting pistols and like here's how you fight the infidels and shit.
Yeah.
It was weird. Ugh.
So I can't even remember if I talked about this when we talked about counterterrorism. I don't know if I had enough time to really nerd out on ISIL-K, but now that we're talking about Nangarhar, I feel like it's definitely a good point, especially with Stu bringing this up. So, you know, they established schools and all these other things, XYZ, right? But so ISIL-K's, let's call it business model, for lack of a better term, was they would come over, they would seize territory, and then after they seized territory, you had one of two choices. You could join ISIL-K or you could die. So a lot of people decided to join ISIL-K. And so after they established these territories in the districts of Achin and Dibala in particular, that's where their original headquarters was at, in southern Nangarhar, they began civilizing themselves. They began building infrastructure for markets. They began establishing schools. They stood up departments that were focused on Islamic education. They established basic training pipelines. They established special operations soldier pipelines. They had a finance department. They had an agricultural department. So like all the functions that you would imagine inside of a normal Western government, ISIS came into southern Nangarhar, cleared out a bunch of Taliban dudes, got a bunch of Shinwari tribesmen and locals to come in and be a part of their network. And if you didn't, then you killed them. I don't know if you guys ever saw that video where they blew them up on the hills in Nangarhar. It was pretty messed up. But as an example, what happened
with Det Tord?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep, that's the one. Yeah, on like a gray, cloudy day on green hills. But so after ISIS got all their pieces together in that area, that's what they started doing. And so they also started issuing funds. They provided better equipment than the Taliban or Al-Qaeda had before. They were getting a whole network and village of like populace and civilization and education and expansion and a market where people could make money. So it was very popular even for people who didn't have that hardcore Salafist ideology that aligned with ISIS's goals at the time, just because it was the hot new jihad, air quotes. It was better funded. It provided a different avenue for how to get after the Afghan government, besides the same thing the Taliban have been doing for the last 20 years. So that attracted so many more people down to the cause than they expected. And I can't remember who spoke on the Uzbeks earlier, but after TTP came over and established this and had this governance, Usman Ghazi, the original IMU leader who was killed by the Taliban, pledged his allegiance to ISIS-K and started sending all of his fighters over to Nangarhar as well, then expanding their network even further, and also their cadre of trainers who were able to teach bomb techniques and HPA tactics and special operations raids, because that's what the Uzbeks were good at.
And I want listeners to know, I don't think a lot of people realize that. It's like, obviously the Taliban are like the poster. Like if you're making a movie, you would put the Taliban on it. But like there's way worse people in Afghanistan than the Taliban.
Oh man, yeah. The Taliban's like can be vanilla.
Right, yeah, the Taliban is really yeah, Taliban is like very vanilla, and you're like, man, that's an eye-opening thing when you realize that, just how effed up the world is.
Like to characterize the brutality of like, you know, the Islamic State in the Khorasan province, their parent organization, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, would routinely, and I remember very vividly, they shot down like a Jordanian fighter pilot, and they put him in a cage, and they submerged the cage into water. Yep. And that's how he died, right? There are much worse people than the Taliban, for sure.
Absolutely.
Mitch,
they lit another one on fire, right?
Yeah, they also lit one on fire. Yep, inside of a cage. They must have had a contract with the cage maker. Speaking on ISIS in Nangarhar, I know that's dark humor, but whatever. It sounds like where ISIS-K went wrong was they didn't have private military contractors lobbying for them.
Yeah. So I think what happened is it was two things, right? So ISIS stopped building their network of recruits in Pakistan across the border. So the early onset, like the startup business model, if you will, involved them running some advanced camps on the Afghan side of the border, but still having a pipeline of dudes coming in from the Pakistan side of the border. Then as they reached what they assumed to be a critical mass, this is, again, my analysis of the situation, that when they reached a critical mass, they kind of stopped worrying about the guys coming over from Pakistan and just more concerned about the governance and expansion. And then the Taliban started heading them with a serious counteroffensive, and they couldn't get forces down from Kunar to even match the force that the Taliban was bringing onto them. And they also didn't have any reserves in Pakistan to bring over the border because they had either exhausted them or given up on their ability to come over. Also, they burnt some pretty critical bridges with Islamic groups that exist in that region that most people who aren't familiar with the Afghan conflict have never heard of. Specifically is Lashkar-e-Taiba, who was ran by a guy named Mangal Bagh, who is a complete savage from the Tira Valley, has waged war against Pakistan for decades. They cut him off because they had some leadership disagreements. They also stopped working with TTP as closely. And then suddenly they were alone and quite afraid in southern Nangarhar when the Taliban started moving in on their positions. And we never formally reached out to the Taliban to say that, we being the task force, never formally reached out to the Taliban to say, we're going to be your Air Force and this is how we're going to do things. But we would be very deliberate about how we struck along the plot to encourage Taliban incursions against the ISIS line. And that combination of events is what eventually led to their withdrawal and removal from the Nangarhar footprint around the end of 19, early 20. And then they collapsed back into Kunar, which they were shortly then removed and or dissipated because they were tired of being hunted and they left an area and decided central leadership was not a good idea.
That's what we talked about last week, that using our Air Force as a sort of Taliban Air Force. And that's you're now the second person to come on.
We did everything short of calling the Taliban and asking them to put flags up along their flat. That's the only thing we didn't do. Yeah, man, I think I would have heard that one on the top floor. I don't know.
Mark target with red smoke. We'll be on the lookout.
Yeah, exactly.
So
I think that would be on like the Culinary Institute of America level, where they would let them know that if anything.
That's why you
I
don't
can
know,
neither
Mitch.
confirm nor deny.
No, like when you talk about like losing the LET, Lashkar Taiba, that's huge because I think when you look at just sheer capability and effectiveness, they are at the tippy top. Lashkar Taiba is
Especially,
responsible
yeah,
for the
especially
Mumbai
geographically in
attacks.
that region.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Like I think we're all pretty familiar with Mumbai hotel attacks. That was Lashkar Taiba. They are very good at what they do.
Yep.
That's a huge loss.
Absolutely, especially because they had the same ideology. And after they did that, they were in a territory where the majority of the people making up the organization were Orakzai tribemen who are from central western Pakistan, some people from Bajar, some Uzbeks, and a very select handful of Pashtuns. And if you listen to the show regularly, you understand that Pashtuns are the majority population in Afghanistan, all the way from the south in Helmand and Kandahar to the northeast of like Nangarhar. And suddenly you are somebody who is not local to the land, who has no handler or translator to speak for you, and you are surrounded by your enemy in high terrain. And that's why ISIS eventually faded away from southern Nangarhar, which brought Nangarhar to its last phase before eventual Taliban takeover of the country, which was Taliban resurgence. And depending on who you ask, and I mean that from a local perspective, like a local Afghan perspective, it could have been for the better. So there's anecdotal stories of Shinwari tribal elders who essentially became part of an indentured servitude process for ISIS, where they didn't commit, but they didn't die. They weren't killed. And so they were essentially slaves for ISIS people. However, the Taliban, recognizing that Pashtuns were in the area, giving them Pashtun Wali, and deciding that they weren't going to treat people with extreme cruelty like ISIS was, kind of changed the paradigm. And it's hard to say because it's not an actual study of data we can collect off of hundreds of thousands of people and give you a percentage of those who approve over Taliban over ISIS. But overwhelming majority of a lot of human reports that came out of the region after ISIS left was that people were way more stoked on the Taliban because they were from their area. They gave a shit about the personalities that were involved in the villages, and they didn't induce cruelty anymore like they did in 1995. So when ISIS is removed from that area, you suddenly have a large swath of territory that's extremely important for the Afghan government that has sympathy towards the Taliban, up into the point of willingly letting them stay in their homes, specifically in like Koigani, Shirzad, Hisarek, and Western Nangarhar, and allowing them to eventually quietly take over Jalalabad without much force. Because if you guys read much about the Taliban takeover of Nangarhar, they didn't blow up a bunch of shit. They didn't assassinate a bunch of people. They like very quietly came in and took it over.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of been their MO though, right?
Absolutely. Why would you waste the
Um,
manpower and kill people who are going to potentially join your cause in the next 6
exactly.
months?
I think this is a good point to bring up. We talk about ISIS-K and the Taliban, and the biggest difference between the two groups, other than obviously, ISIS-K was born out of frustration regarding Omar's death and they're getting covered up, and there were other contributing factors, right? But that's the big one that's put out there. But your big thing is you're talking about Salafism versus Deobandism,
Yep.
and Deobandism. We've talked on it a little bit. Deobandism is it's almost like it is essentially Pashtun nationalism, right? Like Deobandism comes from this anti-colonial view of Islam, and when you have all the Taliban leadership, especially the original leadership, going to places like Darul Uloom Haqqaniya, where that is the form of Islam that's being preached, and then you counter it with this Salafism, which Salafism isn't as, I mean, it's not about local, right? It's this grander Islamic ideology, and the thing that we've always talked about, and you see it now when there's a couple of Afghan based Afghan journalists we follow, and their whole thing is like, yeah, the Taliban suck, but there's fucking peace right now, and we can live with that.
Absolutely.
You wouldn't get that with ISIS-K.
No, you wouldn't. You'd have ultimate chaos, and obviously they're still inducing chaos at whatever rate they can produce it. Um, and I'm not saying it's right, but it's also very analogous to the mentality that existed after the Taliban essentially settled the dust on being the leader of Afghanistan in the 90s. Is like, well, these guys aren't hella righteous and awesome, but there's not a bunch of warlords killing each other. There's not a bunch of people getting raped in the streets. It's better than the security situation we had. It's still not great, but it's manageable. And I think that that same paradigm existed in Nangarhar during this resurgence of the Taliban to take over the country. That enabled them to take over the super critical node with little to no bloodshed.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think I think in a like bigger picture view of it, like the the interest that like the Arab states had in the Deobandist Taliban kind of waned, and the like ISIS the emergence of ISIS kind of shows that like the Taliban didn't end up being what a lot of those their Arab state sponsors wanted them to be, which was like a sort of shining beacon of like a caliphate, because that's sort of how they were viewed when they came into prominence. Like they defeated an international power and gained control, and you could be this sort of like shining tower of Islamic rule. And the emergence of ISIS kind of show with a lot of the Arab sponsors shifting over to ISIS, kind of shows that they were looking more for kind of like an almost colonial like militant Islam, instead of like people that just want to be left alone in their fucking mountains.
Absolutely. I can tell you because of so ISIS did a few things smart when they stood up their cell in Afghanistan and choosing Nangarhar to do it. One, they picked the TTP because they had the best media production in the region. Hands down, far and above beyond Haqqani and what the Taliban was able to produce at the time, and that's what they prioritized. So that made sense. And then they also decided to bring together people like us know to be some of the more savage groups. So you have TTP Bajr and IMU working together with LET personalities in the same valley. Like that's not good for people who have to be on the business end of what those guys are trying to deal. Honestly, ISIS-K was probably one or two good moves away from having way more success than they would have. If they had been a little more friendly to the Shinwaris and the other tribal elders of the Nangarhar region, I think that it would be a much different story. Their clash with the Taliban coming in on the counteroffensive from the west would have been a much different story than the one we're telling today. They literally dropped the ball by like 2 or 3 moves, because we all saw how successful they were in expanding their ideology and their personalities and their numbers in Iraq and Syria, and they didn't quite marry it up here, and we all know why, because there's Afghanistan isms that exist, mostly along tribal dynamics and different moral priorities or ethical priorities. But if they had done 1 or 2 more steps of their execution process differently, then maybe we're having a different conversation today. They were that close.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference between a caliphate and an emirate when you look at scope, and the Taliban's never cared for a caliphate. They want an emirate. Did want to transition over to the MOAB, the massive ordnance air blast, or as we all call it, the mother of all bombs, which is weird because it's like the third largest bomb, not the largest bomb.
It's definitely not nuclear.
No, it's not. So Stu, Mitch, and I were all in Afghanistan. Mitch, were you up in Nangarhar when it happened?
Was that they dropped it in 17, right? Was
Yeah.
it 7? I was at the task force. I was at Bagram when it happened.
Okay. So we were all the three of us were in Afghanistan, and Kyle has a pretty, I think, a really good analysis of it on his podcast, Green and White. Basically, what happened is like in the summer of 2017, all of a sudden, or spring, sometime in 2017, we dropped it's called a massive ordnance air blast, big ass bomb, basically, and on an ISIS network or an ISIS cell, however you want to qualify it, right, in Nangarhar, and that's where that happened, because this is 2017. This is probably the height of ISIS's control in the region, and I think the last numbers was something like 120 ISIS fighters killed. And this is when Hamid Karzai decided that the U.S.'s presence in Afghanistan needed to come to an end. because apparently we can't be killing ISIS fighters. So, like you being up in that area, what was the aftermath of that up in Nangarhar? Did life become a little easier for you guys?
Um, Honestly, man, it was so what people don't know is we've done probably 2 or 3 different strikes that were very similar to that in terms of ordnance, weight and target significance. Because it's not like it was some giant ISIS training camp. It was like a ISIS defined city slash town. Let's call it town because it was Afghanistan that had like a tunnel system and a network of fighters, and it was mostly to send a message of look what we can do to your area because it was at the mouth of Momon Valley, which is inside of a Chin district, which was the headquarters of ISIS-K's caliphate, air quotes, big air quotes, caliphate, at the time in Afghanistan. So it was half a targeting strategy and half an IO message of, look who you're fucking dealing with. We are the United States of America. We have things like this at our disposal. As far as the EKA, that remains a hot topic to this day. Whether or not it was on a bunch of dudes who were running around doing nefarious shit, or if half of it was on like fighting positions where there was some tunneling interconnectivity. Regardless, though, after doing that and either removing a good amount of fighters, but let alone sending the message of what we were capable of, if I remember correctly, I think within about 30, maybe even less days, one of the first ODAs, so Operational Detachment Alpha Special Forces teams with Afghan commandos started clearing Momon Valley, and slowly but methodically removing ISIS from the valley over the next 8 to 9 months.
I do remember hearing back from people in the States who were like, "Oh fuck, we're still in Afghanistan." Like that's the biggest takeaway from that is people were like, they didn't realize that we were still over there.
Yeah. So like, regardless
like,
of whether or not it was as good as people advertised it to be, what it did do is ignite the ground campaign instigated by U.S. forces through special forces to actually start physically removing ISIS from this place. Because until we were willing to do that, they were just going to keep on keeping on, and there's nothing we could have done about it.
Yeah, I think the biggest difference it made is it buffed up a lot of OERs. I bet. who wouldn't throw that?
At
on
least
there?
one.
Yeah. You ever get a Vita Vice from the jock? No, I'm just kidding.
You get that. I think they just launched that particular bomb just to see what it would do, because Afghanistan served as like a testing site for a lot of things. So like sometimes like we'd be like, there'd be like a house manufacturing, homemade explosives, right? And it would be cleared out or whatever, and be like, we have to destroy it, and be like, how are we going to do that? Same, GBU or whatever. Like, hell no, we got a HIMARS rocket.
We got the new one. Yeah, exactly.
Like, what the hell? What's a HIMARS rocket? Oh, it's a Lockheed Martin multiple launch rocket system. We got one here. We can shoot it from Bagram, and it'll sail right across the freaking desert and blow the thing up. Like,
I remember when they moved a HIMARS truck to JBAD for like the ISIS targeting shit. And we were like, oh, what are the capabilities of a HIMARS? And we started looking into it, and we're like, it can remove a grid square from the map. Like, it can literally destroy a grid square's worth of fucking terrain. And we were like, yes, please. May I have another?
Yeah, they're so cool. And Lockheed Martin advertises it as a affordable solution. It's $5.1 million.
You're launching telephone pole-sized missiles.
Yeah, we're $30 trillion in debt. We're $30 trillion in debt, Kyle. They don't give a fuck about the cost.
What's another $5.1 million?
I had this conversation with my buddy over the weekend, the one I was in Ranger Battalion with. We were like, it's crazy, is we used to take a multi-million-dollar ISR asset to follow 2 guys through the desert in Zabul whose combined net worth was $50, and they were riding a motorcycle that cost them $125. And we decide they're so important, we eliminate them with a $500,000 missile.
We've always decided when we were doing our missions flying around, we just like, why don't we just pay these dudes to be good? Like, it has to be cheaper. Like,
if the money keeps coming, they're going to say yes.
Right. Be like, we'll pay you like $500 a year to just like check in with us every month or whatever at like this desk, and we'll just give you some cash.
Yeah. Don't be an asshole.
Don't shoot at us. I think it would have been cheaper. That whole strategy, just a universal basic income for Taliban, would probably have been a cheaper war strategy than whatever we came
I don't know if I've said this on here before, because every time I do this podcast, I get fucking drunk, and I'm already drifting that way now. But if we were getting ready to invade Afghanistan now, I would be like, everybody needs to pump the brakes. We got to give the Taliban like $500 million to give up bin Laden and a fucking case from a couple of dudes from Ground Branch. And we will let them keep on doing whatever the fuck they want to do. But that $500 million is for bin Laden. Give them to us. And I guarantee you they would have done it. And if it wasn't 500 million, we would have definitely agreed on a figure that made sense. And
So
we would double that.
exponentially cheaper than the fucking war.
You have definitely brought that up. We have all definitely not been sober when it was brought up.
Nor are you now.
I think a $500 million plus like a decent like 12 pack from a local like PNW craft brewery, I think could get the job done.
So,
if not, make it a case.
Easy sell.
Somebody take the money and damn Pashtun Wally, dude. Somebody would just turn him in. Like,
Absolutely.
Mullah Omar wouldn't. I don't care if Mullah Omar turns him in. Somebody will turn him in.
No, you mean this is like 3,000 times my GDP of the last 100 years? Let's go.
Okay, sorry. That trumps it.
Oh, well, I'm out of shit to talk about.
I am too, but thanks
I
for
think
coming
we
on, Mitch.
covered, while there was a lot of sidebar going on, I think we did cover a 20-year timeline of Nangarhar, which is the important part.
And people do like the sidebar stuff. Those are the funny stories.
That's the best part.
This is probably the most
parts.
on brand for what an actual walk around the boardwalk was like. Like we would start talking about one thing, and then we'd spend 10 minutes talking about something else, and then like luckily somebody would remember what the fuck we were talking about. We'd slide back over to it.
Oh man, some of the best conversations I had was when I was in the targeting shop at the base in JBAD, and it would be like two NSA SIGINTers, like me as a JSOC targeter and two like ground branch targeters, and we'd be, enjoying libations and then start talking about our opinion on the situation. Man, we could have solved the fucking war if we wrote that down on a whiteboard, let me tell you.
Dude, it's amazing.
No one ever asked us. That's the thing.
Yeah.
I know, right? Nobody ever cared. Yeah, exactly. That's like coming out of the mailroom and giving the CEO advice. They're like, "Fuck you."
Right. Yeah. I remember. So I remember. I guess this would be the last thing, right? When I was at First Corps, I had the privilege of I got to like pick a topic and do like a big giant ass deep dive to sit down with the CG and talk about. And this is right around the time that ISIS is forming in Syria. Well, being the former AQI analyst in Iraq, I'm very familiar with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and all that stuff. So I built this shit out, and I built this like 90-minute brief, right? And so the CG, granted, we're PACOM, right? We're Pacific Command. We're not going to do shit regarding ISIS, but he's got questions about it, and he's like, "Well, what should we do?" And we had all these fucking colonels like, "Well, we need to, a strong, fast reaction and." Do this and do that. And I'm just sitting there going, I remember when we went to Iraq last time and a bunch of white dudes showing up telling the Iraqis, telling the Arabs how it's going to be didn't work out very well. And so instead of saying something like, well, sir, if I were king for a day and were in charge of the counter ISIS mission, I'd probably reach out to an ally like Jordan and have Jordan lead the counter ISIS operation. Like lead in quotations, right? But at least the presence or the appearance that it's an Arab nation doing it. And there's like a bunch of guys who are all full board colonels who, I just got done doing, a rotation at NATO. I know what I'm talking about. And I was just like, holy fuck. Now I understand why we were losing all these wars, because these guys had the same opinions as the guys before them, and none of them were any good.
Yeah. All the guys before them got promoted. Got to be doing something right. Yeah,
but like, had they asked like Sergeant Pop's opinion, and I was like, "Well, sir, I think Colonel such and such is a fucking moron because we can't do it that way." I even if I said, "Well, I disagreed. I think we should do it this way," that still wouldn't have it would have amounted to nothing.
And none of it matters anyway, because all those guys that lost the war, they got promoted up, and they're on the board of Raytheon. They're getting ready for the new one coming.
Hey, Raytheon's already got long range missiles heading over to Ukraine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, Lockheed and Raytheon will be just fine, guys. Don't worry about them.
Portfolio is going to crush it in the next quarter.
I did sink $5,000 into Palantir, so I'm ready.